Skills are basically a programming language at this point, but like programs, they need to be maintained over time, especially when you start using these skills across your team or in automations that run on a schedule. So I want to talk about how we maintain skills that run hundreds of times a day on the open source Warp repository, because it's a general strategy that anyone can use that you probably haven't seen before. Now we call this self-improvement loops. No, we're not talking about Andre Karpathy's auto-research Rube Goldberg machine. It's much simpler than that. Let's say you wrote a PR review skill that you use locally or on a GitHub action. You create that skill, you commit it to the repo, and then you set it up for your team to start using it. And then as more people use your beautiful skill, you realize it's not so beautiful. Maybe it's hitting gaps in certain front-end tasks that you didn't think about, or it's not tuned to give you the right output, or it's just pushing your own agenda. Now when this happens, you might notice their feedback as it rolls in with GitHub comments or messages in Slack, and so you head over to Claude Code, you point it to that feedback, and then you say, we gotta update the skill. Now, it's very tempting, but there are a few problems with that strategy, and the main one is gonna be overfitting, especially if you're looking at each bit of feedback independently, and doubly so if you're asking an agent to address that feedback. You end up with monkey patches on the skill that address each of these one by one, but they kind of miss the broader picture. The better strategy is to wait for the feedback to roll in, maybe a few days, maybe a week, so that you get enough data points to actually figure out what changes need to be made to the skill. And this is really just a soft skill that you should use for design in general. The same way you wouldn't create an abstraction just because you did something twice, you shouldn't create an abstraction in your skills based on one or two people's feedback. Now, of course, this is easy to say, but are you really going to go through every last data point every 1 week and write the perfectly crafted skill patch? Probably not. It is good to have an agent that can help you with that sort of thing too. Now this takes us to a very simple feedback loop where we want some place to store that feedback, GitHub comments, Slack, wherever else. Every week we want to review that feedback, PR changes that we think are necessary to the skill, and then keep going. And for the review piece in particular, you'll want to reach for some sort of automations that the agent wakes up, has whatever tokens it needs to grab the feedback, and then give you an initial draft to start noodling on. And there are so many ways to do it these days. You can use Codex automations if you're a Codex app person. Claude has routines now. Warp has the Oz scheduler. There's all sorts of things. And then you can have that scheduled agent take an initial pass on what it thinks it should do and also list out the feedback it found valuable. Now I know what you may have heard, which is you should always update your skills manually so that they're never verbose. And that is true to an extent, but I have found that having a PR land on your desk every week to update your skill lowers the friction so much that you can't help but maintain the skills that you write. Now there's two things that you'll need if you want to set this thing up at home. The first one is an update skill. So this is kind of a meta skill that describes how do you collect feedback from everyone that's using the skill, and how do you reflect on that effectively to actually make good edits instead of just monkey patch edits. I'll show you a couple examples of skills we've written for that. And the second piece you'll need is, of course, the scheduler. Now, the example I'll show you is this skill that we wrote to have an agent triage issues that we get on our open source repository. It's pretty simple. An agent wakes up whenever an issue gets filed. You can see an example of that here, where a bug came through and the agent colored in some detail on what it found and also asked some follow-up questions to get a higher quality trace before we start working on this thing. And the skill details exactly that. It describes some of our label taxonomy so that it knows how to auto-label for us, and also what we expect out of a good issue triage. Now, of course, this thing is getting called many, many times. This is a large repository. So we want to make sure that it's doing its job, and if a user ever leaves feedback on this thing, we don't miss it. And so we wrote another skill that we use to update that triage skill over time. Now, there's two important parts. The first one is instructing the agent how to gather feedback. In this case, we wrote a Python script that gathers all the issues from GitHub. And then the second part describes how it should take in that signal to figure out what is worth changing. For example, if someone's flipping the same label on and off, or it's toggling labels, that probably means the labeler isn't working as expected, so we should have it make a change. And then we set up an automation to run this skill on a weekly basis. So here it's pulling in that skill, it's grabbing down the repository, and it's looking for all of that feedback to decide what to update. Here it noticed a few bits of user feedback that it needs to address, and it suggested a code change in a PR. Now for a peek behind the curtain, this is how I set up that automation. This is using a cloud platform called Oz, which lets you create a cloud container just using Docker so that the agent can run around, inspect a code base, and make a pull request. I have a whole video about how that platform works if you're at all curious. The only thing to know is you need to set up a cron job once a week to run this skill. And here's a draft PR from that scheduled agent. You can see it took in a few signals from comments that were left on an issue. This is really nice if you're even just going to manually update the skill, just having all the feedback right there. And then it described the change that it decided to make, which was an update to the labeling system. From here, I could review on GitHub, pull it down to make some tweaks, and then redeploy to see what people think. Now, we're using this all over the place across Slack bots and other things as well. You may not relate to that yet, but trust me, if you work in a workplace with Slack, you will see some agent automation bots. And shout out to Petra for writing this really great article about agent feedback loops. Here's a good example of how you might apply this flow to a non-engineering setting where we have this Slack bot that aggregates all the feedback we get about Warp across Reddit, Twitter, and other forums and gives them to us in a feed so that we can see them and respond to them. And the part that we wanted to fine-tune was a suggested reply. So that way we can jump in with documentation notes that we would have to go look up otherwise, or links to related GitHub issues if someone's already talked about the problem. And if we ever want to give feedback and say, hey, you should be writing better replies, we just respond in Slack threads. So here Petra said we should link to the docs whenever we're noting documentation. And of course, we set up a reply learning skill that kicks in a few times a week for this one, looks at all the feedback that we give in those Slack threads, and then decides how to respond. And we've shared it in a GitHub gist for anyone who's curious about it. And you'll notice that the way we train the agent to take in feedback is a lot like how an engineering manager might tell you to accept feedback. Identify what went wrong, look for patterns, ask why, and do a bit of self-reflection, zoom out, check against our existing principles, so that way it's not just monkey patching, it's actually looking for details, and then asking it to edit and commit the code. Of course, you'll want to change your learning skill depending on the model that you're using. We happen to use the Claude series of models for this skill, so we found this set of instructions to perform pretty well. But if you're using GPT or Gemini, you probably want to tweak this to taste. So hopefully this gives you some ideas on how you might improve your skills over time. If you're just getting started with this sort of thing, the easiest way is to just write down all the feedback that you have for an agent in a little notepad off to the side in your computer, and then write one of those update skills to have the agent look through that feedback and improve its work. And over time, I have a feeling you'll end up with much better skills than you would have just updating everything by hand. With that, like and subscribe. I'm doing a lot more content about coding agents. I'll see you in the next one.